First, thank you all for coming. It is an intimate setting that we get to quite enjoy, and I think that, Eric, thank you for the chance of letting us carry the smallest installation ever at SCI-Arc. I think we've done, this thing was like 35 feet tall, and I was scared shitless when we put it up. But now we get a second go at it, and it's only 18 inches tall, and I think kind of it produces a completely different...
Does it have a foundation?
No foundations. Anybody can do it with foundations. Otherwise it wouldn't collapse.
Yeah.
But there's a... I think that let me go back to the question from this point of view, if the constructability of it matters. And I think that this is something that this is obviously a project that is a lineage, is one of a project of many, of a technology that we've been developing in the last, I would say 5 years, maybe more closely in the last 2 years. I kind of am heavily invested in in understanding the possibilities of the technologies that we put together. And by technology, I mean like literally building or building technology, things that we can make things out of without knowing exactly what that thing is about. But in a way, trying to kind of like invent a system that is flexible enough that is able to carry many different ideas and many different situations.
Just for the hell of it, because it's not readily apparent, why don't you describe it, while you're talking about it in more general terms, and describe it a little bit more in specific terms, what it is and why it is what it is and how it works, and why it's, as you claim, flexible, notwithstanding you decided to make the Champs-Élysées.
Champs-Élysées, yes, it's a Champs-Élysées and Eiffel Tower in one shot.
Maybe.
So it's a little, if you squint, there's a little bit of Eiffel Tower going on, but it's just like you see that it's bent and it kind of carries all the way around to the other edge. Basically, I'm very interested in spaceform technology, which is something that is sort of like studied kind of like at the beginning of the century, and it carried out as an investigation all the way into particularly the 70s, and kind of like with a really heavy emphasis on the efficacy of a space frame to kind of like cover large span structures. In a way, it's sort of like a very economical way of covering space. So it's kind of how to cover a large amount of space with a very minimum use of material. And that sort of like triggered an interest in kind of that particular way of putting things together that led me to see that there was kind of like quite a constraint. What it was kind of interesting from an economical point of view, it was also very constrained in terms of how much form you can execute out of it.
But this has more to do with frugality. It has to do with efficiencies. They're qualities that you don't hear discussed so frequently, particularly in view of more exotic conceptual organizational ways of making space. So there is a presumed virtue in a minimally efficient structural component that can be replicated. So once you make, I mean, I'm giving the explanation, but once you have one, then you put it together, but you're essentially continuing the assembly of a single conceptual piece. Right.
So it's minimize the amount of detail and increase the complexity. So, I mean, I think that's sort of like the equation that we try to resolve.
Whereas Patrick's argument would be you don't need to do it, and that the capacity to fabricate now, whether it's a vacuum form and CNC, plasma cutting, 3D printing, whatever it is, allows us to move beyond a pro forma where something modular or repetitive or predictable is, I don't want to say antiquated, but because I think that's not fair, but is from their vantage point. I don't know why I'm bringing them up, but I was just looking at
I think it's a good contrast.
So you're making a different conceptual argument. I think it's important for people to hear and to understand what it is, what you're arguing for or what you're standing for.
Well, let me tell you a couple of, as an architect, and in a way trying to understand my own goals or re-understand kind of like the directions that I set up for myself. I also kind of had to reevaluate and reestablish a hierarchy of what I think about the work and what do I think the work is offering. In this sense, I think I kind of like, in parallel to the development of the technology, there's also an interest in what is it that exactly this technology can do, and and one of the things, the logistical values of the project are as important as the formal values of the project. And in a sense, there's a pair up of the technology that allows you to execute very rapidly, to put something up and very rapidly take it down. And I think kind of like that idea of kind of like bringing the dimension of logistics in terms of execution of a project.
So, and why is that advantageous? I mean, if I said, why is time part of the equation, or why is that a value or a virtue in this, and what's the answer to that?
I think that there's a need for what I call evanescent cities, or cities that they materialize, and then they materialize kind of like quite rapidly. And not only that, there's also kind of like an industry and so on that kind of is based on those values. And all of a sudden, the idea of being able to kind of like very rapidly set up a complex structure and letting, I mean, like the demands for this specific piece of work was to be able to set it up in 7 days from the ground up. It had to withstand 7 sort of 60-mile-an-hour winds for a period of 2 weeks, and then be able to come down in 24 hours. So in a way, that's the new square footage. Before it was trying to figure out how to put 2 bedrooms and a bathroom together. Now we actually have to know how to manage time and establish kind of like a sequence of, I call it almost like a choreography, kind of like a building technology that it kind of also kind of incorporates a way of the way you put it together and how you put it together is like the utmost value to what you actually do. And most of those things are actually kind of like front load of the project. It's not something that we kind of go fishing about, and it's just like something that we need from the outset of the project in such a way that we're able to execute.
But the argument, I mean, and the terms are worth considering, understanding, and thinking about a little bit, because you're listening to somebody talk about complexity, and I think you hear the term a lot, applied in very different ways to very different subjects. And more than that, complexity seems to be ipso facto, meaning automatically a virtue. A virtue. So you have to decide whether it's a virtue. But to get to the complexity, you're developing complexity out of a unit which is redundant or at least repetitive. So maybe it's worth discussing how a single unit replicated in the aggregate adds up to something which we could consider to be complicated. What makes it complicated?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, like one of the things, I mean, going back to the issue of complexity, mainly it's a problem of how we can deal with complexity. And I think one of the interesting discoveries, now that my friend Bruce Danziger just made it to the talk, I think kind of one of the ways of dealing with complexity as an architect is always be able to kind of like establish a dialogue with people that they know where my knowledge stops, somebody else can kind of like carry the ball, and in terms of kind of really pushing the complexity and understanding of a complex issue that, that we wouldn't be able to do it just by ourselves. I think kind of in this sense, and I think, and I tried to kind of like put like one little paragraph together about not necessarily to honor the people that we work with from the team, but also kind of like for everybody to understand that these type of problems, they can only be tackled by a series of individuals. I mean, it's just like, I wish...
Let me back up before you get into those kinds of acknowledgments. I just want to stick with the question of what constitutes complexity derived, not the one we were talking about with Patrick, which is different, but would also be argued for as complex.
Sure.
So if that's so, then I think what we've already discovered is there are different spatial, organizational, structural definitions that seem to both constitute complexity. Therefore, what makes this complex?
Yep. I think I will talk a little bit about the logistical bodies. Let me just describe the project behind actually the formal aspects of what you're looking at. On the one side is sort of like a funicular arch derived from a catenary. Day one, that seemed kind of enough. It seemed kind of like a good enough of an idea for something to span and climb up in height. The main problem, that was sort of good enough of an idea until you actually start kind of like having lateral loads that come to that piece, and we needed to kind of like deal with them in a certain way. And the complexity that arises of that is just kind of like, well, we come up with the idea of increasing the size of the base. It's like, well, if the base is a little bit wider, maybe it's going to resist the lateral loads a little bit more. Now the question, and this is sort of like where the complexity comes in, is just like how much should we increase by? And I think that's sort of like a question where I mean, going back to the idea of the complexity in terms of when an issue like that, it's just we can either eyeball it or we can actually study it. And in this case, I mean, kind of like the idea of expanding the base. It was expanding the base. I was expanding it by 7 feet. And now it actually kind of, once you actually start computing the engineering behind it, it actually had to expand by 20 feet. So what you're looking at, in a way, in kind of the formal outcome, and just kind of in terms of the study of it, just like you see sort of like something that is like 35 feet tall, and it needs to widen up at the bottom in such a way that it can resist lateral loads with a minimal penetration of the ground.
But, okay, so are we saying that the configuration of the piece, or all of the pieces, is attributable to resisting the lateral loads in a way which allows you to build this without constructing a foundation?
One of them, yeah.
In other words, the multiple arches and the positioning of the arches is a function of resisting.
That's a configuration of the basic configuration of the structure. Let's say the compositional element.
But it's just so what it sounds like you're saying is that the object owes its meaning to an obligation to confront a series of structural problems
on the one
that are
dimension.
a consequence of the fact that you can't, because when I asked you initially if you could build a foundation, then, for instance, it would be interesting to see, but it would be very different. If you had a foundation, what would it look like? Not to say it couldn't look like that, but if the premise of the project is to do it efficiently and to do it in a way that resists lateral loading, and that the solution here is literally, I'm not saying it literally, but that if it were a consequence of dealing with lateral loading, then it really owes its definition to its capabilities and its incapabilities of the system to deal with lateral loading. So the multiple arches and the positioning of the arches is your way of keeping it from falling down.
Yeah. Now,
so it looks like that, so it won't fall down.
That's the one discussion. Now, the second discussion is the artwork. I mean, like, this is another interesting discussion. I get to the third point later, but now let's go into the artwork because it's another dimension. This is also like a collaboration with a series of video artists that they were kind of commissioned to develop. This is kind of what we call the gateway structure for a big, massive concert with welcoming 80,000 people during one weekend.
So wait a minute. So did you people go to Coachella? Do you know the event? Like, just for the hell of it. If you can't.
You made it, so
you can't vote. Because one interesting and I think essential aspect of this is how it's organized on the site. What's the site plan? Why is it where it is? And other than the argument for the efficacy of the project as a consequence of the structural issues, why is it what it is, where it is, vis-a-vis the issues of music and people and all of that? In other words, did you site plan the thing? Why is it where it is?
Just so you understand the complexity of a project of this kind, we didn't know the siding of the piece until we actually got with the structure on the site. All we knew was at a polo field.
But it could have been like over there.
It could have been over there, yeah, just like, but I mean, in terms of like, we needed to be able to react to whatever that was thrown at us, to be able to execute the project. So in a way, just like sometimes we start from a more solid ground, literally just like we know where we're going, we know what the conditions are. In this case, we actually had to kind of like keep enough of the result open in such a way that we will be able to deal with the situation as it arises. So now, if you look at the arches, I mean, like
I mean, where is it? Is it right in the middle of everything, or is it off to
it's
the
actually
side?
between. It's a kind of Coachella is sort of like a series of stages distributed in this series of polo fields.
Right.
So big open ground. There's I think about like 7 stages, and there's 3 main stages.
But this is not. Is this a stage?
Well, this is the 4th one. No, it is like a stage for the people, not for the musicians. So you will have, let's say, the techno, the emergent, and then the established bands. So just, those are kind of like 3 corners of a square. The 4th corner of that square was the gateway structure. So any kind of concert, any camera filming the concert from the stage outwards should have been able to capture the gateway, because it kind of was sort of like the main art piece of the. So that was actually kind of one of the requirements, that the visibility from the stage point of view. The second one was the entryway. Now, what you look at the ratio, the proportion of the arch, is actually kind of like a 16:9 proportion, which is kind of like HD video. So now it's just kind of, that's kind of where like another set of people come into the equation, which is kind of like all of the video content, the production of the video content, and being able to kind of like generate a canvas for that.
So the dimension of the piece is a function of high definition video?
That's right.
In what way? So I mean, what are the
16, the proportion of this thing is 16 in one way and 9 on the other.
Where's the projection coming from?
From the 2 towers. We have like from the
tower
projectors.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This model, what you guys are looking at, anyways, just as a disclaimer, is the exact video content that we projected on Coachella. Well, I think like the artist Brian Place, led by Brian Place, they developed about like 18 hours of content. So we were able to.
It's like a loop, and it runs on 18 hours.
Yeah, but not only a loop, it also kind of like something that they were able to kind of digitate and kind of change on the go, kind of like in real time, and respond to kind of like the conditions of.
So what would they be responding to? More people, less people, more
people,
noise, less.
Mood.
It doesn't produce sound, does it?
Imagine it's like you have to be able to respond to this. You have to be able to respond to a sad tune and to a catchy tune on the other side. And I think kind of like the way kind of like the architecture and the light show are able
to a what?
Catchy tune, like a catchy tune, like something.
And a sad tune?
And a sad tune at the same time.
Don't have any happy?
And that usually, if you've been to a concert,
happy?
If you've been to a concert lately, that can happen from 3 minutes in, 3 minutes out. And I think that's something that's sort of like a capacity that we're asking. I mean, in this case,
I mean, it's a legibility. So the idea is that somebody who would be esoteric enough to be able to differentiate sad from catchy, if assuming
and
we could say
to
what
it.
That meant. So then somebody over here,
somebody behind that projector is adjusting in real
Khalifa
time.
is here, JayZ is there, and Mick Jagger is there.
And there's a guy over there kind of like trying to put it all together in real time.
Yeah.
So I mean,
and you can read that. I mean.
Oh yeah. There's like, I mean, also there's kind of like.
So can you read it to us?
In this case, I don't see which
sad
Khalifa.
or catchy.
No. Well, that's the thing. It's just like you have like a repertoire of light shows that you can actually choose from and very quickly kind of like shift from one to the other.
But isn't it interactive? In other words, if somebody does
some of them, I think if you look at some of the videos here, you can see some of the audio reactive ones. I mean, that they're basically just kind of like a sensor, kind of like picking up the bass or picking up the high notes in a concert, and the light actually responds to it. So in a way, that's sort of like a dimension that we're asking out of the architecture. Or something that we are able to enable artists to do that. You know,
Well, let me just ask you one other thing. If you're at that corner or that corner,
Yep.
you don't see it. If you're at this corner or that corner,
Yep.
you see it. So one argument might be that it's positioned in a way in order to address where everybody is,
Sure.
or it's positioned in a way that even though everybody is there and there, you want them to be here and here.
Yeah.
Therefore, I'm trying to understand
In that sense-
how what you see in the image of the organization is related to the positioning of the people that surround it.
Now, let me finish up with the idea of complexity that you asked for. But just once you add all of those values out,
Catchy and sad, it's not so complex.
out of all of that, once you add all of those things, it's impossible to resolve that thing with an equal arch. Yeah, with a circular arch, a circular and planar arch. Like, let's say like a Roman arch. So that's a little bit of kind of the other way around. It's just kind of that complexity, or the complexity of the project emerges out of like trying to fuse all of these inputs are within kind of like a single project and with a single technology. Now, as far as, there's obviously kind of like a predictability about, one of the vantage points that I personally favor.
Is it bilaterally symmetrical?
It is. It's just like, well, it's actually.
It's over here, you can't see it that way, but if you line up on this
Well,
axis,
the thing is just like the content was designed frontal to the piece, and the way we put the piece on the ground, it was always to privilege a sideways point of view, in such a way that you're never gonna front. I mean, that's like the driving movie theater. I mean, it's
But
obviously.
I guess what I'm asking you is the images of the projection,
Yep.
is that bilaterally symmetrical because the
Oh, on the
structure-
one side, it's actually the same
structure
content.
isn't, the physical structure, which is, it
No,
seemed
no,
like
no,
an
hold on.
interesting.
It's adaptative. I mean, it's not symmetrical at all. If you look at the piece,
I'm
the
just
vi-
talking about the light show.
No,
not
no, I'm talking about, yeah, the video content is actually mapped to the surfaces of the model. The model could have been completely regular for that matter. I mean, the fact that there's like symmetry in
But
it.
even if the video content were regular or symmetrical, it's symmetrical on a structure which is asymmetrical. Anyway.
No,
so-
the only thing that it has is just like that it's the same content on both sides.
Oh, I understand that. I was talking about not both sides, in other words, from Peter to this corner.
But in terms of-
talking about from left to right as you
Yeah,
face it.
but in terms of content, you'll see that it doesn't need to be symmetrical. The content of the piece doesn't, you'll see kind of there's many
No,
different.
I'm not saying it needs to be.
Yep.
I'm just saying it could be.
It could be, yeah, it
That
needed
the
to be.
symmetry of the light
Which would
is
be
contradictory to the asymmetry of the
Totally.
arch.
Yeah.
Which would make a different kind of point, that even when you produce symmetry, you're producing it on a surface
can-
which makes it asymmetrical.
Totally.
So why make it asymmetrical anyway?
Yeah.
All you gotta do is make it asymmetrical, you build it that way, it comes out
And
asymmetrical.
then symmetry.
That makes sense.
Then symmetrify it back with the light show.
Yeah, right. What else?
Well, this is also like
Can we turn off, what happens to it during the day?
it's a shading structure. It's actually kind of the interesting thing was sort of like the place that.
Well, you know what I mean? I mean, if it is, I mean, this goes back to the original question. In other words, is the meaning of this project contingent on the light and the music? Or is it like
If
the
you're-
thing you did, it was, have a second, if you, like the one in the gallery, is it contingent on the efficacy of the structure? Meaning, I don't need light, I don't need music, there's a structure, it's fine.
I mean,
Or not?
the most remarkable thing. I mean, like one thing that people value in a large polo field is shade. And the interesting thing about, I mean, the main idea behind it was just like during the day, and also kind of like the way how much we twisted the form and how opaque or transparent it was.
So tell us where the sun is.
The sun is kind of like going up, almost like it's north to south in this direction, in such a way that we can kind of maximize.
That way is north?
What's that?
Which way is north?
I mean, it's kind of in this direction, kind of transversal to
Just
the
like
piece.
where the camera is?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In
Okay.
such a way that we can maximize the projections on the morning and in the afternoon, kind of like out of the arches. The interesting
So
thing,
in the morning, everybody hangs out on this side?
on
and
this
the
side, and then in the
everybody
afternoon
hangs
on the other side.
out.
And
Did it work that way?
was that? Oh
Did-
yeah. I mean, just like the amazing thing is that you would get like at the festival at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and everybody would be hanging out up to here. And then you would come at 6 o'clock, and it would be up to here. So it was
But
just like, there was actually
does the
people.
light show work during the day? No.
No. Just like the shadows are. It's sort of the shadows are actually dictating where people sit as the sun goes down.
Right. Is this an event that works day after day? Or
3
is this
days-
an event
3
that
days.
only works at night?
No, it's 3 continuous days. It starts at noon, and it
So when you
finishes at 2
go,
o'clock in the morning.
what time do you show up?
Oh, I showed up at 6 o'clock.
AM?
No, PM. I wouldn't go when the sun was up. I mean, like,
Right.
I'm old, man. I mean,
No,
just
I
like,
was just trying to understand whether this has a meaning absent the light and absent the night.
there's definitely a daytime dimension to it. The scale of it kind of is also there's a daytime. The idea of providing shade during the day was crucial to the piece. It was as important as being able to be a screen at night.
So, I mean, the answer to the question of its meaning, I'm not sure you can be convincing about this, but you're saying it's intelligible with the lights off and the sun up, as it is with the sun down and the lights on.
2 different experiences. You know,
Did the size of the audience reflect that, or does it just gets crowded at night?
I think when you have 80,000 people, whatever patch of shade.
80,000?
80,000 people.
But you don't have 80,000 in this thing.
I think you can see 80,000 people at the end of any one of these videos. You can see 80,000 people walking by. Yeah.
Walking by.
Yeah.
Do you get something in particular if you walk through?
Sure.
As opposed
I mean, that was sort of like an intimate experience, kind of within the piece. It was actually kind of like it's sort of like a very small space, kind of between the elements.
people hang out in that thing?
Oh, I mean, people were
Yeah.
the strangest thing. First of all, there's a lot of.
We can use our imagination.
You can use your imagination, but the interesting thing is just like, and this was my favorite. I mean, the way of using this thing is obviously you discover as people kind of inhabit it. But the amazing thing was like people would love to hang out in these those little ones. So you have like couples, just kind of like going, just like looking up.
Nobody tried to climb up
Nobody tried to climb up.
because it looks promising in that way, like
I know,
a little bit Saarinen. And it doesn't produce music.
No, I mean we had enough music already. There were like 75 bands or
Right.
something. So it's
Maybe
like,
somebody wants to go somewhere
no, but I think it's just
not
like
hear any music.
not yet. I mean, like I think the next ones that we're kind of like mapping out, they're a little bit more. Yeah, they kind of incorporate sound and light.
Do you
and
think
gravity?
do you think it would work for one person, or it only works for 80,000 people?
I mean,
One person handle that?
hopefully-
One person walk on
let
this
me-
site,
let me
look
put
at
it this
it,
way.
and turn around and
Hopefully
run away.
it will work for every single one of those 80,000 people. What's about that? So yeah, hopefully it works kind of like at the individual scale. I mean, like we got like pretty amazing comments out of this thing. I mean, like people enjoying these things. Those kind of things that you really. That's not kind of what we. Supposedly what we do, but it's kind of like interesting when people can discover something out of like a piece of architecture so in such an immediate way. And definitely, I mean, like there's a short life, I mean, like that is interesting about it. I mean, like I tell you, like there's a few questions that came to my mind as we were developing this type of work, and it was as simple as like, well, what is the role of, I mean, just as stupid as like, what is the role of the architect in this type of thing? So kind of, or not that of the architect, of architecture in itself. And it was really interesting to know that kind of working is not that easy to kind of like set up an experience that measures 35 feet up and 70 feet across.
That's not a dimension that was given to you.
No,
That's
what I'm saying is just like
you
that.
gave it to them.
None of the single parts. I mean, like, and this is something that we discover along the project. It's kind of like from the arts, the engineering, and the architecture for itself. I don't think that any one component will have been able to figure it out entirely by itself. And I think kind of like the
So this is the composite project.
Absolutely.
argument,
I mean,
right?
like 100% composite, and kind of like trying to kind of like put these 3 venues. I mean, like I'm gonna say
And you're comfortable with that. I mean, did you pick the video guy?
I'm not only comfortable with it. I promote it. I fight for it, and I think that is the only way to make stuff.
Right. Let me go back to that because I don't know if we answered this. When I said, would it work for one person? I think we all know it's the context of the project probably unlikely to be conducive to one person and 79,999 and no esta or something. But in a philosophical way, whether this kind of experience can be personalized or whether it only belongs to the context of a crowd. I don't know what would be a good example. If you went into the Colosseum and you're the only character in the Colosseum, as opposed to, I know it's not identical, but maybe it's, as opposed to they're not, in other words, is the meaning of the experience a function of a collective idea, or could it be understood in terms of art and sound, one person at a time?
I think that what you're talking about, I don't know if I would reduce it all the way down to one person, but I think I kind of, what you might be talking about is kind of like how much detail, I mean, like, and detail in terms of elaboration of an idea we need to imprint in the work. I mean, it's definitely not I mean, like, I call it kind of like building up intimacy with the work in such a way that it is approachable. It's not something that we experience as, 80,000 people would, like from 5 miles away. It's something kind of like the degree of engagement and almost the tactile quality that was built into the project was absolutely necessary. So in a way, the legibility of the project and the idea had to be kind of like multi-dimensional to a certain extent. And that, I think, that's kind of where you see kind of like the slight rotation of the arches, the word space in between, the dimension of the entrances to that kind of middle space, the idea of the reflective. I mean, those kind of ways of engaging with a kind of like almost a pedestrian scale.
I think it's probably useful for students to see what the interest in putting something up and having it there in an abbreviated time frame and then taking it down implies for a structure, as opposed to a more conventional idea about architecture, which is there's a lot of money at stake and it needs to be durable. So one of the issues that seems to belong to a lot of Alexis's work is this ephemeral quality. So if it's ephemeral architecture, it's operationally intelligible based on very different technical constraints. So I think this is at least worth being clear about. In other words, if we were to do something analogous, I'm not sure what it would be. And I think, as I said a minute ago, if you were to do it using foundations, and you say, okay, this is what we need to do, never mind the light for a moment, as a consequence of the fact that laterally it needs to be self-supporting without pouring concrete, as opposed to laterally it can be. And then you get, if it's there forever, you get Saarinen's thing.
Sure, yeah, if you would push it, I mean, I wouldn't even have to do it. I think Saarinen did an amazing job in that regard, and it's obviously an inspiration behind what we do.
Do you think the form of the arch as a conceptual model, I mean, for instance, if you cut the arch in half and it went up and it hung there, or it cantilevered, in other words,
well, let
me just get to the end of it. If you have an unusual system, which is unusual as it relates to putting something up efficiently, quickly, inexpensively, but in the end, the configuration of it is something we know and we recognize, at least generically. It's a special kind of art. Nevertheless, it's an arch.
Yep.
So as an argument, is that something we want to get over or get past? Demonstrably, should the system be applied in a different way to a different configuration? For instance, You can see it when it was under construction.
Oh yeah, I mean, like one interesting thing. I mean, I think at the arch, if anything, I wish everybody could make an arch and own it because it's really difficult. So I recommend everybody does an arch at some point in their lives because it's a really interesting. The arch sort of as a form you can recognize. That's why kind of like the arch and the
It's
mix.
an interesting argument because one response to that might be like Alexis already did like 8 of them.
Right.
So why should I do the 9th?
Well, it's just like I think that there were like thousands of arches before, and I actually, if you look at some of these things, I actually look at the history of arches and kind of like try to understand their development and so on. I've never seen the split arch before, and we had to come up with Bruce and one late night. Finally, that was one way of and I thought that brought something to the arch discussion. Now, the ephemeral, you know, like just the idea of foundation but no foundation. First of all, that's something that makes the project or breaks it. I mean, under these kinds of scenarios. For example, the last piece of work that we're doing now, we're working with another event in San Francisco in a park. In this case, we were able to penetrate the ground with 18-inch earth grabbers, each screws. I mean, so each one of those things. It was sort of minimal, but we still had kind of penetration in the ground. In San Francisco,
It'll be interesting to see, by the way, especially for students, physically, what the pieces are.
Sure.
I mean, it's always an interesting trick in presenting a competition. You actually walk in and you say, you know, here's a threaded rod. That's what it looks like.
Yep.
You know, to see what the pieces actually are.
In San Francisco, we cannot even touch the ground. So in a way, kind of like the new pieces that were
Can't touch the ground.
We can't touch the ground. I mean, like it can touch the ground, but you can anchor to it. You can anchor, you can throw a line, you can sustain. The only thing you can do is ballast or do what we're doing now, which is miracles.
What?
No, I don't. Well, anyway, I'm just talking about more, not about the solution of what we're doing now, but about the
So
problem
it
that all
hangs
of us.
from a tree or something.
No, but all of a sudden you go as an architect,
Can
you
a
find
trees touch the ground on this side?
this touch the ground, and just I show you that one. We do that one in the library the next time. But the interesting thing is, as a constraint, it gets to the point of like you want to cover a piece of work, and you start having these hurdles that are. Well, sure, you can do it, but you can't touch the ground. I mean, you can insert anything in the ground. And I think that's sort of like, that has to trigger there new type of problems, and they trigger new type of solutions.
I think if you went back and rolled back the tape, no one of the, I don't know, 60, 70 people who presented ever said, I'm doing this because the foundation requirements are the following, or the ground conditions are the following. It just, and I think this was one of the reasons we wanted to show this, that again, the efficacy or the constraints, the technical constraints that allow for certain inventiveness, but prevent other solutions as a basis or as a premise for doing a project, you don't hear so much. And I think because from a certain point of view, it's not theoretical enough, it's not philosophical enough, it doesn't belong to any music or poetry or digitally sophisticated pro forma. But in fact, it's certainly a valid aspect of building, and we started out by saying that's the issue here. So it's worth looking at and understanding why it is what it is and how it got to be that way. And it's quite different than what you've been listening to the last few days.
Let me add one more dimension that is as important or more important, but definitely has a kind of high value, which is like the team. I mean, and the team behind these type of things. I think one of the very simple things to remark about this thing is just like that this is built by architects. It's just like we have like, kind of like a sophisticated team of people that we've been working together for, I don't know, 5 years now, with graduates from SCI-Arc, graduate students that they pursue an interest in kind of like in building things. And the crew behind these things It's not a building crew by itself. It's not somebody that is not familiar with the profession. It's not somebody that is solely interested in the act of putting things together, but actually people that are interested in the full legibility of the process, legibility and execution of a process. And I think that's sort of like something of the work that I don't even know if it would be possible without that degree of that intellectual development about the type of work that we do. And I think the capacity of being able to read a process, a very complex process, at every stage, from putting screws up to understanding how to order elements or how to kind of like sequence assemblies, is something that you actually have to study a lot for. You have to develop a lot of experience, and it's just not something that
it's unusual. I mean, on one hand, it's an unusual way of building. It's a seat of the pants way of building. In other words, it's not a formal contractor, subcontractor, engineer, architect process. And on the other hand, I'm not quite ready to equate it with an orchestra and with musicians, but it is being built by people who are cognizant that it could be other than what it is, that it represents not only a way of implementing, but it represents a series of choices, and the people who are building it and designing it are aware of what those choices are. So it's not only what it is, it's why it is what it is, and the team that Alexis has is sharing in that, which makes it a unique kind of implementation process. I mean, I'm not sure how long you can keep that going, depending on the scale of what you're doing. But certainly at this scale, you can do it.
I think I'm kind of at the scale of experimentation, and at the scale of like being able to go there and take a risk, and kind of having like the best team available to kind of like help you go through those adventures. I think it's kind of like, it's definitely like something kind of an invaluable kind. Yeah. And I think that's sort of like one of the, so far, hopefully when we grow and we do like 150 of these ones, that we can train people on how to do it and so on, which we hope that we will be able to. But right now that's not the case. And while that's not the case, that still enables us to do it.
Perfect. So thank you very much for your work and your effort and your lesson, I think, to the community, which is
I have one more.
Very appreciative.
One more. And now it's just like, I think
time is up.
This is sort of, this is also kind of, I want to pair this, I mean, this is just talking about my development as an architect, as an educator, and as being part of SCI-Arc. I think I wouldn't be able to do this type of projects if I haven't been experimenting and kind of the support of the school for the last, I think, 8-9 years now. And I think that these type of projects and this type of development are a consequence of that investment and that idea, investment in who we are and what we do. So it's something definitely that we appreciate, and I think that this same thing shouldn't be underestimated. I think that sort of like enabled us to kind of like carry and continue to investigate ideas and hopefully evolve a little bit. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. See you next.
Thank you for coming.